In 1867, a cowboy on the Chisum Trail cracked 2 ribs after being thrown from his horse. There was no doctor, no pharmacy, and no town within a 3-day ride. By morning, he was back in the saddle. What kept him alive was a poultice his trail cook made from plants growing beside the river. Number 14 on this list contains a compound a billion-dollar pharmaceutical company patented 30 years later. These are 25 of the remedies that kept the West alive. Number 25. Cobweb wound dressing. When barbed wire ripped through a forearm or a knife opened a hand to the bone, the first thing a trail hand reached for was not a bandage. It was a cobweb. Ranch hands scraped spider webs from barn corners, balled them into a sticky gray mass, and pressed it directly into the wound. The bleeding slowed almost immediately. Old-timers carried wads of it in their saddlebags, the way a modern paramedic carries gauze. Researchers at the University of Nottingham confirmed in 2012 that spider silk proteins accelerate blood coagulation through vitamin K in the silk, which activates clotting factors. The cobweb also created a physical mesh over the wound, functioning as natural gauze. Every barn in Texas had a first aid kit hanging from the rafters, and nobody called it that. Number 24. Whiskey. Every cowboy carried a flask, and it served 2 medical purposes that had nothing to do with morale. Before cleaning a bullet wound or cutting out an infected abscess, whiskey went directly into the wound. Then, the patient drank what remained. Trail bosses allocated whiskey in their supply budgets the same way they allocated quinine for malaria country. Ethanol at concentrations above 60% kills most pathogenic bacteria through protein denaturation. Standard Frontier whiskey ran 40 to 50%, not optimal, but dramatically better than river water. Men who cleaned wounds with whiskey had measurably better survival rates. The Cowboys arrived at germ theory through observation 30 years before most physicians accepted it formally. Number 23. Raw honey for infected wounds. A cowboy with a gash from a horse's hoof or from a knife fight had the wound packed with honey and wrapped tight with linen. The honey created a barrier that allowed gas exchange, but kept infection out. Every ranch kept honey jars for wounds as much as for eating. Raw honey contains glucose oxidase, an enzyme that generates small amounts of hydrogen peroxide inside the wound, killing bacteria at a cellular level. The low water content also dehydrates bacterial cells through osmosis. In 2008, hospitals facing antibiotic-resistant infections began reintroducing honey-based wound dressings in clinical settings. The Cowboys knew this worked in 1870. Medicine came back around 138 years later. Number 22. Chewing tobacco poultice. This one turned stomachs, but cowboys swore on their lives. It worked. When a rattlesnake struck or a scorpion stung, the nearest man chewed a plug of tobacco into a wet paste and pressed it directly onto the wound. Trail bosses on drives from Texas to Kansas carried plugs of tobacco specifically for this purpose. A plug cost 5 cents. It was left on the sting for 20 minutes and then replaced with a fresh chew if the pain continued. Tannins in tobacco create a drawing effect, pulling venom toward the surface. Nicotine has confirmed anti-inflammatory effects at the cellular level. Modern studies confirm tobacco poultices reduce localized inflammation. Out on the range, 5 cents was sometimes the difference between riding and being carried. Number 21. Yarrow. Every experienced trail hand knew it by sight before they knew it by name. The feathery white wildflower covering every meadow was the first response when a man had cut himself with an axe and the medical wagon was 2 days back. Fresh leaves were crushed and pressed hard into the wound. The bleeding slowed. Sometimes it stopped entirely within minutes. Civil War field surgeons kept dried yarrow in their coat pockets as standard supply. The folk names told the story: soldier's woundwort, staunchweed, the nosebleed plant. A 2021 clinical trial in the Journal of Ethnopharmacology confirmed yarrow reduced bleeding time by 47% through achillin, which directly activates platelet aggregation. The plant is named after Achilles, who by ancient accounts used it to treat his soldiers at Troy. Number 20. Prickly pear cactus. When a branding iron slipped or a campfire got too close, the response was immediate in any camp that knew the land. Draw a knife, split open a cactus pad, press the thick, cool gel flat against the burned skin. The relief was nearly immediate. Comanche and Apache healers had known this for centuries. Vaqueros along the Rio Grande taught it to Anglo cowboys by the 1850s, and it spread north along every cattle trail within a generation. A single plant cost nothing and grew everywhere the sun baked the ground hard enough to create the burn. A 2014 review in Molecules confirmed that prickly pear contains beta-caenins and flavonoids, with documented anti-inflammatory and wound-healing properties. Number 19. Wild sage. The silver-leafed plant that carpeted the high plains and smelled sharp enough to clear your head from 50 feet. A strong sage tea, gargled twice a day, knocked out a sore throat faster than most things in a trail doctor's bag. Women packed dried sage into tooth cavities to kill dental pain until a dentist could be reached. On the frontier, that might mean never. Sage tea broke fevers. The volatile oils promoted sweating, dropping body temperature naturally. By 1870, sage appeared in nearly every homesteader's kitchen garden between the Rockies and the Sierra Nevada. The active compound, thymol, is the same ingredient in Listerine mouthwash, which was formulated in 1879. The frontier women who packed sage leaves into aching molars were delivering the same compound. Number 18. Plantain leaf. The low, flat-leafed weed that grew in every wagon rut and cattle trail across the frontier. Pioneers called it white man's footprint because it seemed to follow settlers wherever they went. They brought it on purpose. Trail journals from the 1850s mentioned poultices of plantain for bee stings and infected wounds so frequently they were as routine as bandages, and on most of the trail, they were used instead of bandages. Allantoin and plantain accelerates wound closure and reduces scarring. It is the same compound now sold in wound creams for $12 a tube. Aucubin and biacolane have confirmed antibacterial activity. A 2015 review in evidence-based complementary and alternative medicine documented plantain's full wound healing and antimicrobial profile. Number 17. Echinacea. Every tribe on the Great Plains, Cheyenne, Lakota, Comanche, chewed the purple coneflower root at the first sign of infection and brewed it into tea for respiratory illness. Settlers adopted it within the first generation of contact. From 1880 to 1930, echinacea was the single most prescribed botanical medicine in the United States. Not a supplement, but a prescription written by licensed physicians. It was removed from official medicine not because it failed, but because it could not be patented. A 2015 meta-analysis reviewing 24 randomized controlled trials found echinacea reduced cold incidence by 58% and cut duration by nearly 1.5 days. The cowboy who chewed the root at the first scratch in his throat was practicing evidence-based medicine. Number 16. Willow bark tea. Every frontier river was lined with willows, and experienced trail hands knew which valleys had the best stands the way they knew which waterholes were safe. The inner bark, stripped and steeped into a bitter tea, was the standard treatment for fever, headache, and the bone-deep ache that followed injury. Willow bark contains salicin, which the body converts to salicylic acid, the active ingredient in aspirin. A cup delivered the equivalent of roughly 2 standard aspirin tablets. Bayer patented aspirin in 1897. The Cowboys had been brewing it from willows for 30 years before that patent was filed, with no organic chemistry, no laboratory, just observation and the willows growing along every waterhole. Here's where this list gets uncomfortable. Every remedy you have heard so far was called frontier superstition at some point during the 20th century. Pharmaceutical advertising, beginning in the 1920s, made a deliberate effort to associate plant-based medicine with ignorance and modern medicine with progress. Within a single generation, knowledge that had kept millions of Americans alive across a continent was reclassified as folklore and abandoned. The clinical literature of the last 30 years has done something remarkable. It has gone back and confirmed, one remedy at a time, that a significant percentage of what those cowboys and pioneer women knew was pharmacologically accurate. They did not have the vocabulary, they had the results. Number 15. Golden seal. The demand across the 19th century frontier was so relentless that the plant was commercially depleted in many regions within 2 generations. That tells you more about how well it worked than anything else could. Cherokee healers introduced it to settlers for wound infections, eye inflammation, and dysentery. Civil War surgeons on both sides requisitioned it by name. The active compound berberine has confirmed broad-spectrum antimicrobial activity. A 2014 study in the journal Molecules documented direct activity against MRSA. A 2015 meta-analysis of 27 randomized controlled trials found berberine comparable to metformin for blood glucose reduction. 2 centuries of frontier evidence preceded every one of those trials. Number 14. Meadowsweet. This is the one with the compound patented 30 years later. Settlers who knew it from Europe brewed it into a tea for fever, headache, and inflammatory pain, mild and palatable where willow bark was intensely bitter. Both plants contain salicylates, the family of compounds Bayer synthesized into aspirin and patented in 1897. The name aspirin comes from Spirea ulmaria, meadowsweet's old botanical name. Bayer named the drug after the plant whose chemistry they had copied. The critical difference is that meadowsweet contains stomach protective tannins, which pharmaceutical aspirin does not. The pioneer preparation was safer than the copy. A 2013 review in Phytotherapy Research confirmed that meadowsweet acts through both salicylate pathways and additional flavonoid pathways the pharmaceutical version does not replicate. Number 13. Oregon grapefruit. In 1849, a wagon-trained physician watched 3 children die of dysentery in 1 week with an empty medical chest. A Shoshone woman walked into camp carrying dried Oregon grapefruit, brewed a tea, and the children who drank it survived. The plant grows throughout the Pacific Northwest and Rocky Mountain region. Plateau peoples had used it for stomach infections and dysentery for generations before contact. Settlers adopted it along the Oregon Trail and spread the knowledge east. The active compound berberine inhibits the adhesion of intestinal pathogens to the gut lining. A 2012 study in the American Journal of Gastroenterology found berberine significantly reduced the duration of acute infectious diarrhea. She had the right medicine, he had nothing. He had the good sense to use what she brought. Number 12. Elderberry. Pioneer women crossing the Great Plains watched every creek bed for elderberry clusters that signaled the winter medicine was ready for harvest. They simmered the berries with honey into a thick syrup and stored it in the cellar. At the first sign of fever, or the bone ache that signaled influenza, they gave a tablespoon every few hours. Modern research confirmed that compounds in elderberry block the neuraminidase enzyme that influenza viruses use to replicate. It is the identical mechanism targeted by Tamiflu, which costs $150 a course. A 2016 trial in the journal Nutrients found elderberry reduced cold duration by 2 full days. A 2004 study found that it cut confirmed influenza duration in half. The pioneer woman watching creek banks every August was practicing antiviral medicine out of a mason jar. Number 11. Garlic. Every culture that crossed the frontier brought garlic as both food and medicine. Trail cooks who had watched too many infected wounds deteriorate began applying it to wounds as standard practice. During World War I, British military surgeons applied raw garlic to infected wounds when pharmaceutical antiseptics ran out. Russian surgeons called it Russian penicillin. Both were doing this 17 years before Fleming identified penicillin. In 2001, a study in the journal Microbes and Infection confirmed allicin, released when garlic is crushed, directly inhibited MRSA. A 2014 review documented efficacy against over 23 bacterial species and 9 fungal species. The cowboy who rubbed a cut garlic clove on a wound that was starting to streak red was delivering pharmaceutical-grade antimicrobial chemistry from the cook's supply bag. Number 10. Wild cherry bark cough syrup. Wild cherry bark, frontier cough syrup. The cough medicine that kept frontier families alive through winters came from the bark of the black cherry tree, which grew along every creek bottom. Mothers stripped the inner bark in autumn and simmered it with honey into a dark, thick syrup the children actually agreed to take. It was listed in the United States Pharmacopoeia from 1820 through 1970, 150 years of official pharmaceutical recognition. The compound prunicin converts during digestion to benzaldehyde, which suppresses the cough reflex at the brainstem, the same mechanism as codeine. The industry eventually isolated it, synthesized it, patented it, and sold it back at many times the cost of the bark. Your great-grandmother's recipe contained the same active chemistry as the prescription medication that replaced it. Number 9. Mormon tea. Across the Chihuahuan Desert and Colorado Plateau, a jointed leafless shrub called ephedra grew on rocky slopes and dry canyon walls. Navajo and Hopi healers used it for centuries. Comanche warriors brewed it before long raids for sustained energy and endurance. Frontier travelers adopted it for the congested sinuses and exhaustion that came with weeks of hard travel. Ephedra contains ephedrine and pseudoephedrine, the active compounds in modern decongestant medications. Pseudoephedrine is the active ingredient in Sudafed, still sold at pharmacy counters, and now kept behind the counter because of its role in methamphetamine production. The same chemistry that cleared a cowboy's sinuses on a dusty trail is the compound that requires ID to purchase today. Number 8. Boneset. The name came from breakbone fever, the old term for influenza so severe the body aches felt like fractures. When that flu hit a trail camp, boneset was the first response. The bitter, white-flowered plant grew in damp meadows from Missouri to California. Mothers brewed the leaves into a hot tea, put the patient under every blanket available, and encouraged the sweating that often broke the fever by morning. During the 1918 influenza pandemic, frontier communities that could not reach hospitals fell back on boneset tea for weeks. It was listed in the United States Pharmacopoeia for decades. A study in phytomedicine confirmed boneset contains immunostimulant polysaccharides and fever-reducing sesquiterpene lactones. The women who brewed it by lamplight were not guessing. Number 7. Calendula. Pioneer women carried calendula seeds in the same satchels as their best vegetable seeds because they understood it as a supply. The bright orange marigold was grown to make the infused oil that treated every cut, burn, blister, and infection in the household. With dried petals steeped in olive oil, sealed for 4 weeks, then strained into dark bottles. During the Civil War, when hospital supplies ran out, surgeons packed wounds with calendula poultices. During World War I, the British Medical Journal published accounts of military surgeons using calendula preparations when pharmaceutical antiseptics were exhausted. A clinical trial in 2009 in the Journal of Wound Care found calendula ointment significantly outperformed petroleum jelly for wound healing. The pioneer woman's oil was more effective than the standard that came after it. In 1870, the United States had approximately 64,000 physicians for 38 million people. The vast majority were concentrated in eastern cities. West of the Missouri, across the territories where cattle drives ran and wagon trains pushed through, a significant portion of the American population had no realistic access to a doctor for most of their lives. These remedies were not alternatives to medicine. They were medicine, the entire system, the only one available. The people who survived using them built the ranches, settled the territories, and raised the families that are still here. Number 6. Blackberry root bark. Dysentery killed more American soldiers in the Civil War than battlefield wounds. On the frontier, stopping severe diarrhea was survival. Blackberry root bark boiled into a strong, dark tea was the standard response. It was kept in the same cabinet as salt and flour. Tannins in the root bind to inflamed intestinal tissue, reduce fluid secretion, and kill the pathogenic bacteria driving the infection. River traders moved dried blackberry root between settlements as a trade item, just like coffee and quinine. A 2011 study in phytotherapy research confirmed significant anti-diarrheal and antimicrobial activity. Tannin-based preparations remain available by prescription for intestinal complaints in some European countries today. Number 5. Aloe vera. Spanish colonial settlements brought aloe to the American Southwest, and within a generation it was standard medicine on every ranch in Texas, New Mexico, and Arizona. The plant required almost no care and could be harvested the moment a burn or wound needed treatment. Ranch wives kept plants on the kitchen windowsill. Apache and Navajo women used the gel for infected wounds. A study published in the Journal of the American Academy of Dermatology in 1995 found aloe gel healed first and second-degree burns an average of 9 days faster than standard petroleum gauze dressings. 9 days. The plant on the kitchen windowsill of every ranch house in the Southwest was outperforming the pharmaceutical wound standard by a margin a clinical study eventually measured precisely. Number 4. Slippery elm, the frontier stomach coating. Before antacids, before any pharmaceutical treatment for stomach complaints, frontier families relied on slippery elm. The inner bark of the Ulmus rubra tree, dried and powdered, when mixed with water, forms a thick gel that physically coats the stomach lining, creating a protective barrier over inflamed tissue. It is not a chemical reaction, it is a physical mechanism. It was listed in the United States Pharmacopoeia from 1820 through 1960, 140 years of official recognition. The Food and Drug Administration classified it as Category 1, safe and effective demulcent in 1986. A study in 2002 confirmed significant improvement in irritable bowel symptoms. The frontier healer had been using it correctly for 50 years before the first Pharmacopoeia edition was written. Number 3. Kaolin clay. This sounds unlikely, and it has the most straightforward pharmacological explanation. Native American peoples throughout the West understood that swallowing specific fine particle clays with water could stop intestinal poisoning and dysentery. Frontier women on the trail adopted the practice from indigenous healers and passed it forward. Kaolin's layered silicate structure gives it an enormous surface area. It binds to toxins and bacteria through electrostatic attraction, removing them from the gut before absorption. Kaolin was the active ingredient in kaopectate, the standard pharmaceutical antidiarrheal from the 1930s until 2003. The frontier healer and the pharmaceutical company arrived at the identical active ingredient from entirely different directions. Number 2. Valerian root. The psychological toll of frontier life was real and recognized. Loss was constant: cattle, crops, children, men. What communities called nervous exhaustion was a genuine, debilitating condition. Valerian root was soaked in whiskey for several weeks, strained into dark bottles, and kept ready for whoever needed it. A teaspoon in warm water at night could steady a man who could not stop shaking, soothe a woman whose grief had turned into sleeplessness, or calm a child who woke from nightmares months after a thing that could not be unseen. American physicians prescribed valerian from 1820 until 1942, 122 years in the United States pharmacopoeia. It was removed not because it failed, but because patentable synthetic sedatives had arrived. A 2021 systematic review of 60 studies confirmed valerian reduces the time it takes to fall asleep and improves sleep quality. The prescription drugs that replaced it carry FDA black box warnings for dependency and withdrawal seizures. Number 1. White willow bark. Before the word aspirin existed, before Bayer filed a single patent, prairie settlers and cowboy camps were already peeling strips of white willow bark, chewing them or boiling them into tea to kill the pain of toothaches, joint inflammation, and the fevers that swept through communities without mercy. A strip of bark the length of a finger, chewed slowly, could dull a throbbing molar enough to get through a day's work. The bark contains salicin, which the body converts to salicylic acid, the same compound that Felix Hoffmann synthesized for Bayer in 1897, and the world called aspirin. Aspirin did not replace folk medicine. It was born from it, refined, patented, and sold back to the same people who had been using the plant for centuries. The families who peeled willow bark by lantern light for shaking children were the original pharmacists. They did not have degrees. They had results. 25 remedies. From 1,000 miles of territory where the nearest doctor might as well have been on the moon. The men and women who developed these treatments were practicing medicine with the tools the land provided, under conditions where failure was not a journal publication. It was a death. Walk outside this week. Look at what is growing along your fence line, your creek bank, your tree line. Chances are at least 3 plants on this list are within 100 yards of where you are sitting right now. Your great-great-grandmother did not need a pharmacy. She needed her eyes open and the knowledge that someone before her took the time to pass down. Subscribe to Forgotten American Ways. Because this knowledge is not gone yet. It is just one generation away from silence.